If you follow me on Twitter, you have probably seen that recently I have been doing archiving work. And what I mean by that is I have grabbed all my old tapes. I've been a filmmaker for going on 20 years, maybe more actually, professional for 15 or 18 years, but semi-professional, almost professional, amateur, whatever you want to call it, for 20 plus years, 25 years since I was a kid. And I have a lot of tapes, and that includes Beta SP, Mini DV, High 8, VHS, of course. And so it got me thinking, really, we do not know how good we have it today. We really don't. Hey guys, Blake Calhoun, and another episode of Almost Professional, the podcast about mobile filmmaking, indie filmmaking, DIY filmmaking, really all things filmmaking. And today, I'm talking about how spoiled we are, I guess, for lack of a better word. We really don't know how well we've got it today as filmmakers, as video creators. And that really rings true if you've been in this business more than, I'd say, 10 years. If you've only been in this business for the last 10 years, since the mirrorless cameras and DSLRs and such had become the de facto way to produce content, and I'll also include, obviously, smartphones in there. And smartphones really the last, 5 or 6 years to where they've gotten good. Been using them since 2007 or 8, something like that. And the video back then was not good. But for the last few years, and especially the last 3-4 years since the iPhone 6S, the quality is unbelievably good. Exhibit A, I go back and I'm looking at some music videos I did as a student in the mid-90s. And my gosh, back then, it's just you forget. And while, that's a while ago, it really doesn't feel like that long ago. And this actually lasted, I should say, probably until the early 2000s, maybe mid-2000s, 2005, up to 2007 or 8, when HD really took off. And so in the 90s, I shot all my projects on like High 8 or VHS. I mean, technology was around then, and obviously there's been great movies made forever, but you really had to be, in Hollywood to have access to those kinds of tools. Or work for a TV station, and then you might have a beta camera. And of course, that was just standard def video. And at the time, it was great. And it still looks good today if you upscale it properly. And that's actually what I'm doing right now. I'm capturing old projects and I'm upscaling them. And I'm only going to 720p instead of 1080 or higher. I just find you go too high and it does get pretty mushy. But as I'm watching my old projects, and it's bringing back a lot of nostalgic feelings, I still like the work, of course, but it just reminded me of how difficult it was back then to really create anything. And again, I shot most of my projects back then, I'm talking now in the mid-90s, so a long time ago, on High 8 or VHS, and then I edited them tape to tape, and that was VHS to VHS. And so you go down a generation, and then I ended up copying those or cloning those to Betacam. I worked for a production company and I had access to that kind of stuff in the mid to late 90s. I was a production assistant back then. And then eventually I bought my own stuff around 2000. I had a Betacam deck, which I actually have to this day, and I'm using it right now. It's 20 years old and it still works. I've had it repaired over the years, but it still works. And by the way, I shot on film in the late 90s, especially a lot of 16 millimeter stuff. And I've got several short films I did. And I actually did a feature film shot on 16 millimeter film. But everything was transferred. We would do a telecine session where they transferred the film to video. And I did Beta SP or DigiBeta. And I primarily did Beta SP back then because DigiBeta was, at the time, that was really high-end stuff. And I actually have access to DigiBeta decks today. They're old. And I had access to them back then too, but I didn't own one. I did a lot of TV spot work, and so that's why I invested, and I had a post-production company. That's why I invested in a Betacam deck. It's a UVW 1800. Again, if you're new to video and filmmaking, this stuff probably means very little to you, but If you've been around for more than 10 years, you'll probably know what I'm talking about, especially if you've worked for any time at all in video or film production. But again, it got me thinking how amazing we have it today and how we all just complain about how crappy it is. And I'm like, what? My iPhone now shoots 100 times, maybe 1,000 times better than the old Hi8 cameras I grew up with, or the VHS cameras for sure. And including Beta SP, where Beta SP was the broadcast standard forever. It's very low resolution, and even though the cameras had good chips in them back then, it just obviously is nothing like today. And that's of course a good thing. But I go through my YouTube comments and I routinely see people just bashing the quality of the iPhone or the whatever camera it is, even Blackmagic cameras or red cameras. Red cameras suck. Or your iPhone looks like crap. And I guess it's all relative. If you don't know any better, then that's fine. And I'm not saying you can't think stuff looks like crap. Of course you can. But it really puts it in perspective to think about where we've come from. And with video in particular, the last, again, 10 years, I keep saying, it is just leaps and bounds. I watch some of these YouTube channels and the production quality is unreal. A lot of these travel channels, of course, the bigger YouTube channels like Peter McKinnon, where they get all the budgets to go do all these amazing things, or the guys like Sam Colder, you watch those videos and you're just like, my God, this looks like Hollywood level stuff. And it's because everything has been democratized. I mean, those guys are great filmmakers, don't get me wrong. And I always say that even great filmmakers can take crappy gear, even I would say VHS, and make it look great. Well, maybe not VHS, but you know what I mean. But the point is, technology has made it so easy, for lack of a better word, because filmmaking is not easy, and I've talked about that before on this podcast. But it is amazing with modern mirrorless cameras, etc. And again, I would include smartphones in that. You can just turn it on and get great images. You can't tell a great story. I've said for a while that there are a lot of amazing looking films, but not necessarily a lot of great films, but that's a whole nother topic. Right now, I'm really thinking about the production value you can get regardless of the camera today. But it's been a lot of fun looking at my old archive and going through it and seeing not only my progression as a filmmaker, but also the progression of technology over the years. My first feature was shot on 16 millimeter. My second feature was shot on mini DV. I did tons of DV stuff over the years. My third feature was shot on a Panasonic VariCam, and at the time, it was like a $60,000 camera. It was one of my client's cameras, and I rented it. And so that was really high end. That was in 2005 range. My next movie, we went to the VariCam again, and that was in 2010. And I did some web series along the way, and I shot a lot of Canon HDV, and I used lettuce adapters, which I've talked about on this podcast as well. And I've compared them to using like B-script adapters today, the DOF adapters I'm talking about. And those were great, and they were a lot of fun to use. They gave you a look that you just couldn't achieve otherwise without actually shooting on film. Because most of the cameras back then, keep in mind, were not large sensor cameras. They were CCDs, they were chips, and so it was like a 3-chip camera. And they were small chips, like 1/3 inch chips, at least for the prosumer versions that I was using. Again, like the Canon XHA1 or the Panasonic HVX. This has turned into a little bit of a history lesson on video and film over the last few years. And then I caught up into the DSLR revolution, and I did a web series called Continuum, a sci-fi show, and I shot it on Canon 7D. And that was my first indie project that really started to look more like film, in quotes, besides the ones I actually shot on film. And again, of course, I'm talking about working as an indie filmmaker. I have done a lot of high-end commercial and other type of productions on a client's dime using, larger film cameras or using, at the time, again, VariCam, or what else did we use? Well, Red, of course, came along. And the studio I work out of, we got a Red camera pretty early on, back in 2007, but I didn't use it much. It was the Red one. And then my next couple shows were on Blackmagic, and then my most recent narrative work, I guess, let me think about this. Well, I've done a lot of iPhone stuff, of course, over the last few years. And my largest project recently, I would say, was probably shot on Blackmagic or Red. And again, we take all this for granted, and I'm actually lumping myself in there. So doing this recent archiving project has just reminded me of how good we have it today. And so if you feel like you want to complain that you only have an iPhone, or you only have an older DSLR camera, or, you can't afford the latest Sony A7S III or that brand new Sony A1 or whatever the camera may be, don't use that as an excuse. Really don't. The work I did 20 years ago on pretty crappy formats compared to today is some of my favorite stuff I've ever done. A lot of it, to be honest, is. Now, it's not nearly as technically polished, but in the end, it's about telling stories and about the characters. And I know I say that technology doesn't matter, the gear doesn't matter, and in a ton of ways it doesn't, especially today, because your worst camera, in quotes, you can use today is about 100 times better than anything from just a few years ago. It all comes down to the craft when you're talking about storytelling and using the gear. So anything today is amazing to use to tell a story, whatever that story is. And so today's podcast episode is really just kind of a reminder, not only for myself, but to you guys who follow me on Twitter and of course on YouTube. Get out there and make your projects and stop complaining. And I'm not singling anyone out in particular. I guess I've just been reading a lot of my YouTube comments recently and have seen, it's easy to complain. It's easy to be negative instead of being positive about the things we have. And of course, again, we're also spoiled. Video technology has changed so rapidly and it's continuing to change. In the next few years, iPhones, I really believe, unless Apple does something crazy, like take the lightning port away, which it looks like they're going to do, iPhones could easily overtake mirrorless cameras and DSLRs, especially as these larger sensors come into play and or computational imaging. Some of that may drift into the traditional market, I have a feeling, especially for dynamic range and such. I know this entire episode was about tech, but don't let the tech slow you down. Be very thankful for what we have today and don't wait to create. Get out there and make your film. Speaking of legacy filmmaking and traditional media, really, I have decided I am starting a second YouTube channel, and it's not necessarily going to be about filmmaking tech, although that will be on there some. It's really going to be about living the life of a filmmaker, an indie filmmaker in particular. And it'll tie into this podcast, the Almost Professional idea. And so look for that. I will promote that on my main channel, the iPhoneographers channel, but that's coming soon. I've got several videos already produced for that. And I really decided to do it because I do want to talk more about stuff around filmmaking, things you do to make films, or the way you live your life as a filmmaker, job to job. And I think there's some interesting things to talk about there, but it doesn't really have anything to do with mobile filmmaking per se. And so I hope you will check that out when it's available. And I'm going to use the brand, at least I'm pretty sure I'm going to, Almost Professional on YouTube as well. And I might start posting this podcast on that YouTube page as well to have different places to check it out. And lastly, several things going on with my courses and my LUTs. I'm working on a couple new courses. I've talked about them in the past. One is an audio course that is almost done. It got delayed because of the pandemic and then other things, life got in the way. But that's coming soon. And then a couple other cinematography things I'm working on. Also some app stuff. And so look for that coming soon. And then my LUT packs, I've been working on new LUTs for Log V3, which, by the way, if you don't use Log V3, man, Filmic Pro Log V3 is really good. I'm actually very impressed with that. You got to have a 12 series phone or certain Android phones to make it work. But the 10-bit Log V3 is great. And so I've been creating new LUTs for that. I've got one LUT pack on my website right now and more are coming soon. So all this information is on my main website, iPhoneographers.tv, or check me out on Twitter at iFilmmakers, and of course on YouTube at iPhoneographers as well. Well, thanks for listening to this little mild rant, I guess. I'm your host, Blake Calhoun, and this has been another episode of Almost Professional, and I'll look forward to talking to you in the next episode.